Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Great to be here. I think we had a timer here, but it wasn't working. It kept stopping, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Warm welcome. Thank you for joining. Very glad to have you here, sharing your interest and commitment to advancing disability inclusion. Our topic for today is Inclusive HR, the second series of HR-focused disability inclusion services, which will focus on accessible recruitment for persons with disabilities, including assessments, interviews, and reasonable accommodation. My name is Diego Cob. I am with UNDCO Development Coordination Office in New York. And before we begin, we'd like to give a few housekeeping items. To be as inclusive as possible, I give a brief description of myself and invite the speakers, if they feel comfortable, to do the same. I'm a Latin person with black hair. I'm sitting in New York. We do have closed captioning and card services. You could either turn them on directly on Zoom, or we posted the link as well on the chat box. The webinar is being recorded, and we'll be sharing the recording with you after the webinar. We will be having sign interpretation throughout the webinar as well. Feel free to ask any questions either in the chat box or in the Q&A box, and we'll be answering them. Whatever questions we don't get a chance to ask, we'll follow up with a frequently asked questions document after the webinar. The webinar, as I mentioned, will be focusing, as opposed to last week's webinar that was focusing on engaging and attracting persons with disability. This one is going to be in the recruitment process to support and create a more inclusive HR recruitment process within the UN. I would like to introduce today's speakers and the agenda for today. So as I mentioned, my name is Diego Cob. After myself, Heba Kelif will be giving an overview of what the high impact common services as part of the business operations strategy is. Heba is a disability specialist working in UNDCO as well. She's based in Egypt. After that, we'll be hearing from Gopal Mitra, Senior Social Affairs Officer from the Disability team at the Executive Office of the Secretary General. He'll be sharing an overview of the UNDIS, the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, and the Accountability Scorecard. We'll then hear from Stefan Tromel, Senior Disability Specialist at ILO. We'll share an overview of the inclusive HR practices and applicable at the country level and how it could be applicable as well for different entities. We'll then hear from Julianne Di Nenna, Senior Diversity and Inclusion Officer at UNHCR. And we'll also hear from Iris Bertourt, Talent Acquisition Specialist, and Murali Padmanabhan, Disability Inclusion Advisor from the Regional Bureau, Asia and Pacific from WFP. We'll be hearing about their perspectives and experience on inclusive recruitment. We'd also like to take a moment to thank the support team in the back, doing a lot of the heavy lifting. We have Natasha Perkins-Maliko and Stephen Serency with the sign interpretation. We have Sarah Falsey with the card services, and from our disability team that's been supporting a lot of the organizing, Georgia Dominic, Brianna Harrison, and Aina Ephraimson. So with that, before I hand it over to Heba, if she was able to connect, she was having some issues connecting. I'd like to launch a quick poll just to see where everybody's at with disability inclusion in their offices. The question is, has your office taken measures to recruit persons with disabilities? So option number one, yes, several, meaning 3 or more. Yes, few, 1 or 2, perhaps none, or you're not sure. So go ahead and answer in the poll or the pop-up window, and we'll share the results in a second. So we have about 61% of participants that have responded. We'll give a few seconds more before closing the poll. So if you're still there and you haven't responded, just check the window really quickly and we can hear from everyone. So we have about 70% of persons responded. I'll go ahead and end the poll. I see it's going up slightly, 73%. So I'll share the results with you. So 15% of colleagues said there's several measures taken, so 3 or more. to recruit persons with disabilities. 43%, the majority, say there's a few, so 1 to 2. 24% of participants say there's been none, and 17% said they're not sure. So I think we still haven't had Heba join. She was having some issues connecting, so I'll go ahead and share a bit of her part, and hopefully she can connect and share with us a bit later. So Heba was going to share with us how the Disability Inclusion Common Services fit within the business operations strategy. With those of you familiar with the business operations strategy, it's a framework, basically a tool that allows different UN entities to work at the operational level, collaborate, and really leverage whether it's economies of scale, efficiencies, and as well the bargaining power of the UN. And it's not only for efficiency of cost and quality, but also for advancing the 2030 agenda. And in that case, in disability inclusion, we mentioned about these webinars. It's ways that we support country teams to connect it to the different resources available, to also know about the different things. We realize a lot of colleagues, whether it's in operations or in programming, may not be specialists in disability, but to let you know that there are still a lot of resources available, and there's a lot that you can do without having to be a specialist, that you can slowly take steps to recruit persons with disabilities and create a more inclusive environment. Disability inclusion is a big chunk of or a big part of the high impact common services. We also have services that are focused on renewable energy and energy efficiency, as well as we have some related to gender. So gender responsive procurement, how to make our procurement more responsive to gender, as the name says, but as well to support women-owned businesses or businesses that have a gender parity strategy, to also support gender parity within recruitment processes, making the recruitment process more accessible, having enabling environments such as lactation rooms or different practices from the enabling guiding principles from UN Women. So those are just a few of them. As I mentioned, disability inclusion is a big part of what we're doing for that. Heba Kelef, who will be hopefully speaking in a second, is a disability specialist that her role is to support the operations management teams in implementing these services. So that's one of the resources. You'll be hearing about some of the other resources available to you for that implementation. But with that, I'd like to keep it short and be able to give as much time for Q&A at the end. So I'd like to hand it over to Gopal Mitra, so Senior Social Affairs Officer. Gopal has also been the focal point for the UNDIS, and he'll give us an overview of the UNDIS itself and the accountability scorecard. Gopal, over to you.
Thank you, Luis Diego. A very good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues, and thank you so much for joining us today. We are delighted at the EOSG to collaborate with our colleagues in DCO in organizing this webinar series. So in the next 4 or 5 minutes, I'll give you an overview of the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, how it applies to the topic today. But before I go into the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, let me just pause and outline as to who are persons with disabilities, because this is one question we receive in almost all webinars. So for the purposes of this webinar and the issue and the work that we are doing, we follow the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which have been ratified by more than 180 governments, member states. So according to the CRPD, persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, sensory, psychosocial, or intellectual impairments, which in interaction with the barriers in the society prevent their full participation on an equal basis with others. So there are 2 elements here. One are persons with impairments and the interaction with the barriers. So disability is a function of between impairment and its interaction with the barriers that exist in the society in terms of the environment, in terms of policies, in terms of attitudes, and so on. So when we are talking about disability inclusion and our work on it, we are primarily trying to break or address the existing barriers, and in course of our work, not create new barriers because there are already many, right? And in addressing the barriers and not creating new ones, and instead creating a more enabling environment, will be able to advance the inclusion of persons with disabilities. Yeah, so it's important to keep this in mind. So the function between the person with empowerment and the barriers, disability results out of that, and our work is to address those barriers, not create new ones, and instead create an enabling environment. Now, coming back to the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, it was launched in June 2019, just over 3 years back, by the Secretary General to bring about lasting and transformative change on the work of the UN on inclusion of persons with disabilities. So while launching the strategy, one of the observations the Secretary General made is very pertinent to today's webinar. He said he would like to see the UN to be an employer of choice for persons with disabilities. And I think the issue that we are discussing today and our work in this area will contribute considerably to that vision of the Secretary General. Now, the strategy has a wide scope. It covers all the 3 pillars of the UN's work, namely development, human rights, peace, and security. It covers both programs and operations. So it covers not only programs, but internal operations, of which HR accessibility and related issues are part of it. It applies to both headquarters and to the field. Now, the best thing about the strategy is that it has an accountability framework where the teeth of the strategy lies. The accountability framework of the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy consists of 2 components. One is the entity accountability framework, which UN agencies from headquarters to the field implement and report on, and the UN country team scorecard, which all the UN country teams are implementing and reporting on. That's more horizontal in nature, the country team scorecard. The entity accountability scorecard is more vertical in nature. Now, the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy is aligned with other corporate strategies like the Gender System-Wide Action Plan, the Youth 2030 Strategy, and so on. Entities and UN country teams implement and report on the strategy annually. Now, let me give you a flavor of the indicators. So both the components of the accountability framework consist of specific indicators. Now, if you see on the screen, Luis Diego, do we have the slide?
Yes, we do.
Yes. So if you see on the screen, and I'll take you through it, these are the indicators of the UN Disability Inclusion Strategies UN country team scorecard. There are a total of 14 indicators which are clustered under 4 core areas. The first core area is leadership, strategic planning, and management, in which you have indicators like whether the leadership is championing disability inclusion or not, whether the common country analysis, the strategic planning is inclusive of persons with disabilities or not, whether the cooperation framework addresses disability inclusion, whether the institutional setup is proper and or not. The second core area is inclusiveness. There are indicators on consulting organizations of persons with disabilities, accessibility, procurement, and so on. The third core area is programming, where there are indicators on joint programs, how disability inclusive they are, on data, on monitoring, and so on. The fourth core area is organizational culture, which is it's directly related to today's discussion. There are indicators on employment of persons with disabilities, on capacity building, on communications. Now, as you know, today's discussion is focusing on employment of persons with disabilities, HR services. Now, the indicator on employment of persons with disabilities in the UN country team scorecard is directly related to today's issue. It's indicator number 12. In addition to that, there are indicators on accessibility, which is also important. If we are not accessible, our assessments are not inclusive and accessible, persons with disabilities will not be able to work, will not be able to hire. The issue of reasonable accommodation, which is also part of the accessibility indicator. There are issues of the issues around capacity building. Is there enough knowledge and awareness among colleagues to advance the employment of persons with disabilities? And it is the duty, it's the responsibility of all of us, those who are working in HR, those who are hiring managers, those who are supporting recruitment processes, and so on. And lastly, one of the most fundamental things in the work on disability inclusion is to consult persons with disabilities themselves through their representative organizations, which are organizations of persons with disabilities, because persons with disabilities have the knowledge, have the expertise, and they are the primary constituency that we are working with and on. So it is imperative to consult organizations of persons with disabilities in all our work. So I'll stop there, hand it back to Luis Diego. Happy to answer any questions at a later stage. Over to you, Luis Diego.
Thank you, Gopal, for that overview, and I think that sets the stage for the upcoming speakers as well. Next up, we have Stefan Tromel, as I mentioned, Senior Disability Specialist from ILO, who has been at the forefront of a lot of the things happening. He's the first one to say that there's a lot still to be done, but I think there's a lot of headway done. So Stefan, over to you, and we'd love to hear some of the recommendations you have for operation colleagues and staff in general.
Yes, thank you, Luis Diego, and hello to everybody. I will briefly address three issues. One is issues around the job advertisement, the initial process. I will give a couple of examples of, I think, examples of good practice that we have done here in the ILO disability team that I'm heading. And then I've also been asked by Luis Diego to briefly reflect about what can organizations do that have not yet a reasonable accommodation policy and reserve. So let me start with job advertisements. I think what we do in the ILO, and I think many other organizations are doing also, is that in every job advertisement, we include a sentence where we welcome candidates with disabilities. Sometimes also we refer to other issues. No? And I think that this is still important. That I think it's important to realize that very often persons with disabilities have had bad experiences in terms of applying for jobs, not being called for the job or for the interview, or then having been called and then still often not getting a job. So I think showing that we welcome candidates with disabilities, I think it's important, can make a contribution to more candidates with disabilities applying for that. And I would argue that it should be done for all positions, because there's a bit of a risk that sometimes we think, well, for this higher position, it's less likely. Well, it's always more difficult to get good candidates for higher positions, but we should never assume that people with disabilities cannot go for any of the positions that we offer. Then I think it's equally important that we show also that in the process, we make it explicitly clear that if needed, we are going to provide any accommodation to the recruitment process. And that means also that somebody in our human resource team will need to be responsible for replying to a candidate that has signaled that he or she will require some accommodation. And then I think we also need to explicitly say that if the person is selected, that the organization also has, when it has a reasonable accommodation policy, and that will make the utmost to provide any workplace adjustment once the person is on board. So these are just some of the things that you can do. There is some literature around the issue that it's important to look at job descriptions to see whether there are essential and non-essential tasks, to make sure that there are no non-essential tasks which in some way or the other could discriminate on the basis of disability. I must admit that in the ILO we have not had the need so far to make any adjustments to job descriptions to prevent from any discrimination, but perhaps that is something that to be reflected about. Let me share very shortly three examples of colleagues that have joined our disability team. One is a bit older experience, a colleague that joined our team like 5 or 6 years ago. I knew him a bit from before, so I knew his type of disability. I knew that he had a mobility impairment. He was not using a wheelchair, but it was difficult for him to walk long distances. No? And what I did, I spoke with him before he joined the ILO. I said, look, we have a rather big building. The distances within the building are complex. And then he also needs to get to our building from wherever you live. No? And public transport here in Geneva works pretty well. It's accessible if you're a wheelchair user, but you still need to be able to move around, and definitely coming by taxi is not an issue. Taxis are very expensive here. No? So what we discussed and what we then did even before he joined, we bought with our reasonable accommodation fund, we bought a scooter for him to use, not only when moving around in the building, but in fact he was able to use it also outside working hours to come to the office and go back. No? And why I'm highlighting this example first, because we have a fund which allows for that specific accommodation to be paid for, but also the issue is that I think it's very important that when we have a new colleague with a disability, that we don't wait for that colleague to come to us and ask for a specific accommodation. Think of a new colleague, he or she is still getting around the new job, perhaps is younger, is not so outspoken. It's a tough for that new colleague to say, I need this specific accommodation which has a specific cost. I think what is fair for us is to proactively reach out to them and ask them if an accommodation is needed. I go for a second example, colleague that just joined the ILO. It's the first time we have a colleague in the ILO that uses a guide dog, so she's a blind colleague. We had to do a few minor adjustments. We had to help around a bit just to navigate the building. We had a bit with sorting out the public transport. We had to sort out a bit with the cafeteria whenever she goes on her own. If she goes on her own, that somebody can help her with the trays and all that. And we also are in the process of recruiting somebody who can, for a certain number of hours during the week, can help her with reading some documents or preparing PowerPoint presentations or that. Nothing very expensive, but something that definitely will need to be funded from our reasonable accommodation reserve. Third example, an intern that just joined last week. Again, a person with a visible disability. We asked her, she does not require any workplace adjustment at all. So very different situations, some requiring a reasonable accommodation that implies a cost, some not, but also very, very important because for all these contracts, I mean, the third one I said was an intern, there are tools in place where sometimes it's not always that we recruit people through the very heavy proper recruitment process. There are other processes, short-term contracts, internships, collaboration contracts, volunteer issues. So there are many other ways in which, in particular, young people with disabilities can get more familiar with the UN. And I think it will then help them to be better prepared for, let's say, more long-term engagement with the US. So I think it's important also to use at a maximum level these different opportunities to create that pipeline of persons with disabilities that have the knowledge and the skills and competences that the UN requires. Last point I was asked to very briefly address is I would argue that it's important for organizations to have a reasonable accommodation policy and reserve. We have it in the ILO since many years. It's not a guarantee for colleagues with disabilities applying for jobs in our organization, and we can definitely do better than that. Please don't get me wrong. We are far away from being an employer of choice of persons with disabilities, but I think that it's important to have such a policy and such a reserve just to be able to deal with specific budgetary requests, even if they are, as they usually are, pretty low cost. No? But I would also say that if you as an organization don't have yet a policy, I think we should work towards that, also to systematize and to have a way of track recording what you're doing. I think at the same time, there are many things that you can already do, small adjustments that you can make to the recruitment process, small adjustments that you can make to onboarding, which would amount to a type of reasonable accommodation, but you can already do those even in the absence yet of a proper policy. Luis Diego, these are the things that I want to share, and of course, more than happy to address any question later on. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Stefan. I think the examples give a very live way of things that colleagues can do, as well as some of the main overviews of reasonable accommodation, and hopefully we can come back with some questions as well at the end. Before I hand it over to Julianne Di Nenna, I would like to open up another quick poll just to see. We're transitioning into the part where it's in the field, things that colleagues have done, both from UNHCR and WFP. So the poll is asking, has your office taken any measures to, sorry, that's the first poll. So the second poll is going to be asking if you have worked in your country office with a person with a disability. Yes, no, several times. So I'm launching the poll here. So have you worked with a person with a disability in your country office? And the options are about the same. Yes, several, 3 or more. Yes, few, 1 or 2, none, or not sure. And we do realize that a lot of colleagues may not have disclosed, and a lot of the disabilities are invisible, but at least to the best of your knowledge. And we have about 57% response. So before that, I'll share my screen here in preparation for Julianne. Okay, so we have about 67% participants responded. So just one more second. And I'll end the poll. So the majority of colleagues, 48%, said yes, that they have worked with a few. So 1 or 2 colleagues with a disability. 38% said none, and the rest go into yes, more than 3, and not sure. So another sort of thermometer, at least from the attendees, where they stand in their country offices working with colleagues with disabilities. So with that, Julianne, I'll hand it over to you. So Julianne Di Nenna, Senior Diversity and Inclusion Officer at UNHCR. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Luis, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. It's great to be here with you. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the context within UNHCR, and more specifically about the tools that we have just recently put together to create and foster a more welcoming environment, a more encouraging environment for colleagues with disabilities, and to also do outreach and career fairs, conduct career fairs for persons with prospective colleagues amongst persons with disabilities. If you could go to the next slide, Luis, please. Okay, I work very closely with colleagues in our recruitment section to conduct the outreach. And we've built a lot of internal capacity. Well, we hope to have built a lot of capacity internally to UNHCR, so we can become an employer of choice with persons with disabilities. So what specifically have we done? If you could go to the next slide, Luis, please. We have put together to help all of our offices, no matter where they're located, to know what tools they can use to create and foster more disability inclusive recruitment process. And thanks to excellent examples from ILO and from UNICEF, I work very closely with colleagues to learn more from them. We built on their examples and we built our guide. And what does our guide do? Again, it's available to all of our HR colleagues around the world, and to managers and to colleagues with disabilities. In putting this together, I should mention, as we were talking about, as Gopal mentioned, to make sure to work very closely with persons with disabilities. This guide was put together in collaboration with our colleagues with the disabilities and, of course, with HR colleagues in the field, building on their examples as well. So what have we done? What does the guide do? First of all, the guide busts the myths the stereotypes that we hear so much about. It tries to reduce fear amongst managers who understandably say, well, maybe our office building isn't as accessible. Isn't as accessible as it should be. So how can we welcome persons? How can we encourage persons with disabilities to apply if we know there are no elevators, if it's difficult to get to the building because of bumpy roads, there's no public transportation, etc., etc. So the guide actually outlines things for managers to consider. And of course, it gives them the key links across the organization, whom to contact for more information and what to do. More specifically, also the guide outlines steps for interviewing and when necessary, testing persons with disabilities. And it gives a list of possible tools that may be needed in case the persons themselves are unaware of those tools, and how to go about putting them in place. For example, JAWS, where to find it, how to use it, and how to fund it if it's not in the budget already. So it gives very specific steps to our HR colleagues where to find help should they have any questions. And it lays out the process for them to put into place, including discussing with the candidate themselves to understand what their specific needs are, and putting in place the adjustments, making sure the adjustments are suitable. So having that dialogue with the candidates. And in so doing, we hope to create this barrier-free environment where people feel at ease, where they find their needs for adjustments, and where managers understand how those tools and adjustments create a more friendly, a more encouraging, and a more enabling environment to remove those barriers. So again, it outlines the whole process. What we've, and of course, where to go for help. And we've heard from several colleagues in the field after having conducted training on the guide. We've heard from colleagues how it helps put them at ease as well, because it shows them what to say, what not to say, which words to use, which words to avoid, and how to feel more confident about building the process for interviewing and testing. And of course, creating that dialogue that's needed with candidates. Another thing we've just recently put into place to help our colleagues, our HR practitioners and our managers, we've created through a partnership with the Idea Hub of the College of William and Mary, a whole research paper on the different and various types of assistive technologies, and where people can go to find them and where to go for assistance when using these. Many of our colleagues with disabilities already have the tools that they use, for example, JAWS. They already come with those tools and knowing what their needs are. And this paper that we've, through our partnership, the research paper that was conducted, gives them even more information about where to find other types of tools. For example, I'm a parent with 2 children with specific learning disabilities, specific learning needs. When I started out with my kids, I had no idea where to go. And at the time I did a lot of research and still felt as if I was coming up very dry and not finding the resources I need for my kids at the time. So that paper also provides information for parents. We have many colleagues, parents of children with disabilities, as well as colleagues with dependents with disabilities, parents, siblings, spouses, for example. And that paper outlines the assistive technologies that are out there and where to find them, and again, who to contact within UNHCR for more information. And that's a link to our recruitment processes, because it gives an added bonus and added support to our HR practitioners in case they enter into dialogue and they hear about a tool with they're unfamiliar, well, they can go to the paper and find out more. Next slide, please, Louise. And then I will stop very soon and hand over back to you. What else we've done to make sure that we've built an enabling and encouraging and inclusive, disability inclusive environment, we have trained our colleagues with disabilities to take part in our career fairs and outreach along with organizations for persons with disabilities. So they can already begin creating links and not only creating the links with prospective employees or prospective colleagues, but also to bridge the gap and to bring the distance, reduce the distance between people. So they participate in our career fairs. We've also trained our recruiters, and we've trained our HR practitioners. We've had a storytelling session with our HR practitioners as they conduct the outreach about what it means to work as a person with disability for UNHCR and what HR practitioners can do, not only in recruitment processes, but on the job, as Stefan was saying, making sure to know when somebody's coming, what their needs are ahead of time, so their needs, so specific needs can be available on the first day in the office. Next slide, please, Louise. And then I'll stop after this one. So as I mentioned, we had our colleagues with disabilities participate in the career fairs, answering other people's questions. And we've engaged with other UN colleagues for lessons learned as we built this. Again, I mentioned UNICEF and ILO, but we've also reached out to other colleagues in WFP to make sure that we have solid and helpful processes in place, and that we provide the services required. And thank you very much, everyone. I will end there, and any questions, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julianne. And there are a couple of questions coming in, specifically about the guidelines that you created and the Idea Hub and how to access those. I know we had discussed that in the previous webinar. So we'll come back to you with that, or if you can also reach out to colleagues on the chat. So with that, also, we'll hand over to our colleagues in WFP. We have Iris Bertourt, Talent Acquisition Specialist, and followed by Murali Padmanabhan. So Iris, over to you.
Yes, hello everyone, and really glad to be here on this webinar from WFP. I'm Talent Acquisition Specialist working in World Food Program Regional Bureau in Bangkok. My gender pronouns are she, her. I'm wearing glasses, I have short hair, and I'm really glad to be here and talking about the HR initiatives, what we have put in place. So please, Louise, if you could share the next slide. Okay, we can start with the next one also.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. So what I want to talk about today is really what Regional Bureau Bangkok HR unit has done in terms of building the commitment and also the initiatives to enhance disability inclusion. So overall, what happened? So in terms of 2021, our region of Asia Pacific has become actually the pilot region, and RBB has, as a HR, has taken up some initiatives to really to create the disability inclusion roadmap and operationalize the UNDIS specific key result areas. So, for example, the HR, Human Resources, has contracted an external expert and to help us to understand how we can improve our recruitment process. So, for example, first of all, what we did, we focused on the two areas, to review of recruitment processes and also align with the global HR policies, think of the capacity building of the HR people on inclusive hiring. So just really concretely, the main objective why we took on this specific HR pilot project was really to remove the systemic barriers in terms of how I mentioned already, our policy, our internal recruitment process, and also the attitudinal barriers. So overall, the objective was really to ensure that the people with the disabilities could participate equally in the recruitment process of Bertourt program. So all of the work what we have done, it's really WFP specific of our recruitment, of our policies. And what we wanted to make sure as well is that we include all of these processes, our internal people with the disabilities, and also as the external partner we engaged for the specific pilot was the organization with people with disabilities. So it was very helpful for us really to look this from the different angle. So next slide, please. I'm just going to share a few lessons learned and also what we have done really specifically as a few examples. So overall, the two pilot projects took for us like in 2022 mainly. We started in 2021, but most of those pilot projects came until the end. We had a specific technical guidance note, which helped us to take action in a specific way. And overall, as we are pilots, so we can still try out in HR and in our BD region with some specific action, recruitment related action. So as, for example, as some lesson learned here, you can see according to employment, reasonable accommodation and capacity building. So first of all, talking about how actually we recruited our person with a disability for regional disability inclusion advisor position. So what we did first, as when we started with this job posting, we shared widely with the disability inclusion community by the global head of disability inclusion. We received several people or applicants who needed reasonable accommodation. So we did because our system does not allow for some of them to apply. So our recruiters applied half of them. Then as well, we needed to adjust our assessment process. What does it mean? Because usually we assess the candidates with specific technical tools for written assessment or even video interview, and those which we understood through our first pilot project reviewing the recruitment process, we just realized that those tools are really not accessible. So we did this assessment process outside of the tool and also adjusted the time if needed for the people and tried to make the written assessment and the interview as accessible as possible for everyone to participate equally. So as an outcome, we hired as our regional disability inclusion advisor as a person with disability. So the second lesson learned and example what I want to share is around reasonable accommodation in recruitment process. So, and what we have done, as I mentioned, we have created actually a technical guidance note. So this is as a first step. It was 3-month project where we really deeply looked our internal processes. So what we did, we reviewed the policies. We had some workshop with the people with disabilities to understand really what can work and what does not work. And the technical guidance note was created with a recommendation for next steps for HR. So we have completed already few action from this technical guidance note, as for example, we have created our inclusive and accessible vacancy announcement, as also previously Ailo mentioned. So we have taken into consideration to put, for example, first information first, remove some tables from vacancy announcement, things like that. So in RBB as a pilot region, so we are using those vacancy announcement and also mentioning we encourage people with disabilities to apply and providing specific email address for the people who even cannot go to our system for reasonable accommodation. So this is as some example. And as a second, we have also built the capacity of our HR people on inclusive hiring. And this brings me to the last lesson learned. So it was really the capacity development for our region, for our regional HR people. So we did the training of trainers workshops. It was a 3-month project with a lot of learning. So it was the same external disability inclusion experts, and really to build the capacity of our HR people through the workshop on inclusive hiring and disability inclusion fundamentals. So we really had a lot of self-learning, self-study, but as well still like very interactive session and valuable session, especially for example of job coaching, which was the session with the people with disabilities. So it helped the HR people understand like what actually are the realities of the persons with disabilities when they want to apply for a job and how to interview them, etc. So with that, I stop here. If you have any question at the end, I'm happy to answer. So with that, over to my colleague, Murali, please.
Hi, thank you, Iris. Thanks, Louis. Yeah, first of all, I'm really grateful to the UN Secretary General's Executive Office for widening the scope of the disability, because it's an evolving concept. It's not just a matter of protection issue. And yeah, what we learned, what I would suggest, as everyone confirmed, ask the person. Let's not stereotype. The problem is that we look at the individual. Okay, which job will suit this particular individual with this particular impairment? Let's not do that. Let's address the barrier, regardless of the impairment. That is the foremost thing we need to consider. That's the rule number 1. What we have done, we reached out to people, as Iris was mentioning, when they recruited the DI advisor for the region, they reached out to the candidates, what they want as part of the reasonable accommodation. And they also proactively ensured that the platform for the interview is accessible. They checked with the person. They also looked at the kind of, when it comes to the written examination, without compromising the quality, they ensured that adequate time is given to them. And of course, the application, the entry level was paramount important. They reached out to different platforms where you will have some connection with persons with the disabilities, with qualification, of course, to ensure that they can also apply without much difficulty, because at the moment the portals are not that super accessible. We don't want to miss the opportunity. You all know how long it takes for a kind of recruitment process. So we didn't want to miss this opportunity. So reaching out to platforms relevant to people with the disabilities, asking for alternate way of applying, relaxing that. Of course, it's not giving them the concession. The quality will be maintained, no compromise on that, no charity. It's matter of equal opportunity. So that's how we managed, and checking every time what is needed, because we are entering into this. DI has been recognized all across the organization, not necessarily restricted to the program unit. It goes across, and everyone is trying to do whatever is possible from their side, be it administration, be it procurement, IT, whatever you name it, they want to do it at a very, wherever it is possible. Security, they want to look at this, what is relevant. So the demystification was quite important, and the regional bureau is now trying to get into the institutionalization of disability inclusion. I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Murali, and thank you, Iris, as well. I think, again, very useful examples of things to look after. And there were some questions also coming in the chat for you both about the trainings and the resources available. We have a few minutes. Colleagues, now is the time if you'd like to raise your hand to ask a question directly. There are sort of a compendium of resources that are available to you as well. We've posted some of the ones specifically for operations in the chat, and we'll also send them in a follow-up email. In a second, also, we'll be putting in a feedback link so that you can give us your opinion, how we can do better, how we can improve and make these webinars more useful for you. Before that, I'd like to give the floor to Heba, who was able to connect and to be able to share. I'm glad you were able to connect. Heba, over to you. Heba is the disability specialist from DCO that's also going to be supporting operations colleagues in advancing and implementing the disability inclusive services. Heba, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Louis. I hope you can hear me. I'm a person with visual impairment living in Egypt. I'm wearing a pink headscarf with a pink dress. As for today's webinar, I was really happy to be able to catch a little part of it. I was sad that I couldn't connect from the beginning because I had some technical issues. But all I want to say is that for persons with disabilities, especially being recruited in a new job, it's a very stressful situation. And as much training as we give to their colleagues, their persons without disabilities, about how to include and interact and make the working environment a safe and inclusive environment for a person with a disability, it's very important also to train this person with a disability on how to understand the organizations, the dynamics of the organization, to understand the people, have especially if this person has a visual impairment, because he or she wouldn't be able to see a lot of what's happening around them. So what I mean is, if we follow the twin track approach and maybe if create a safe space for a person with a disability to discuss their training needs, if they have issues, if they have problems, they can discuss it. Also, at the same time, these persons would attend the mainstream trainings that are of course conducted within the organization. This will give them an opportunity to interact with their colleagues, and also will give their colleagues the opportunity to understand more about this person's disability. I think starting a new job is always hectic and always stressing at the beginning. So part of the reasonable accommodation that we really have to think about is how to make this transition as smooth as possible, because maybe a person with a disability would not have the same amount of experience or flexibility to deal with and interact with any kind of transition the same way as the persons without disabilities. Thank you very much, Luz, and thank you, everyone. So the floor is back to you, Luz. Thank you.
Thank you, Heba, and we look forward, both Heba and I, to working also at the operations level to support, as well as I know the EOSG colleagues and PPV colleagues at DCO to support you in implementing some of these initiatives as well. I don't see any hands raised. I know there was a question perhaps we can address sort of quickly. Stefan, to you about reasonable accommodation, if you're still there, just asking, you know, how country offices can know of the reasonable accommodations in their entities and what they can do to use them as well. If you're there.
Yes, Luis, Diego. No, I think I answered in the chat the question, but I can do it also here. So basically what we have in the ILO, and a few other entities have it, UNICEF and others, is a central reasonable accommodation fund which was created mainly to ensure that any cost that could relate to workplace adjustment could not lead to a specific office that might have a very limited budget not to employ a person with a disability who otherwise would be the best candidate for that position. So we have a central accommodation reserve. Basically, any cost that would come from here in headquarters or any field office related to a workplace adjustment, the relevant department or office could ask for that fund to cover those expenses. The reserve is managed by our human resource department, and which also, and of course, the request and dealing with the request is managed on a confidential basis because, as you know, it's also important to deal with those issues in a confidential way. No, it's pretty straightforward. We don't have a huge fund. We often get the question, how much do you need? Well, it is probably something that gradually will need to grow if people start being aware of that. I also saw a question about would it be covering a personal assistant? And I would argue yes, if the personal assistant is used at working hours. So there are certain requests could be quite resource intensive. So I think it's good to have such a fund. But the experience also shows that the majority of accommodations are either no cost or low cost. No, it's more flexibility in time. It's minor adjustments, including some of those that I mentioned before in my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. And I've put also in the screen the upcoming webinars as well on disability inclusion next week and Wednesday, September 14th. We'll be having the webinar on ICT and digital accessibility. We thank you very much for your time. We thank all the speakers and interpreters, and we look forward to continue working with you to advance disability inclusion and to make the UN more and more an employer of choice. Thank you very much and have a nice day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.